Welcome back. All right. So international tournaments. We're talking right now. It's all four nations, everything, and of course, if Canada loses tomorrow, that's it. They're in decline. It's over. It's finished. One game tells us everything we need to know about the state of hockey in the world. And if the USA loses tomorrow, well, I guess USA is just not. It's so weird. It's one game. It's just. But hey, I wanted to talk about some other times where we've had those discussions. I wanted to look at NHL participation in tournaments. We're going to also talk about the WHA's participation in a tournament nobody ever talks about ever anywhere, even though it was a big tournament. So, obviously, looking at international tournaments with NHL involvement, you have to go back to 1972, Canada and the USSR, the Summit Series. The total unknown that was the Soviet Union slash USSR, and fascinating hockey. Now, this is before my time in that I wasn't born in 1972. So it was an 8-game series, and the Soviets owned that series early. And there's a famous speech of Phil Esposito tearing a new one off of Vancouver fans for booing Team Canada during the game, talking about how they were trying their best, and it wasn't, kind of like, you come down here and see what you guys could do against these guys are really good. And what Team Canada found was that, yeah, the Soviet players were excellent, and this was not going to be a gimme. The idea that Canada is clearly it's our game, so we own it, has been there for a very long time. And the reality is that in international tournaments, Canada hasn't owned it the way that you would think that they would have. And so Canada beating the USSR was a big deal in that Canada won games 6, 7, and 8, all in the Soviet Union. So all on hostile territory, and ended up winning the series. 4 wins, 3 losses, and a tie. So thankfully they didn't tie one of those games, or else we wouldn't still be talking about that team and talking about whether or not they belong in the Hall of Fame. The whole team belongs. Oh, Henderson belongs in the Hall of Fame. It's a whole discussion based on the 1972 Summit Series. Interestingly enough, they had a Summit Series in 1974. The difference being they grabbed WHA players. So this had Gordie Howe in it and some other pretty big names. But nobody talks about it, right? The Soviets won that series. Another part of the reason you don't hear about it. If Canada won that series, I think it would have got more press. But the Soviets went 4-1-3 in that series. So they won 4, lost 1, and tied 3. It was pretty handedly they beat the Canadians. And this is where, of course, the NHL would say, well, we didn't send any players, so that's why. But the WHA and the NHL were in the midst of a bit of a war of their own, in that the NHL wanted the WHA to cease existence because they were forcing the NHL to actually pay their players money and give them guaranteed contracts and give them freedom of movement. Who were these crazy guys in the WHA? So, yeah, I've talked about WHA before. Interesting, but that was the second and final of the Summit Series. Then Soviet teams start coming over to play and play against NHL clubs. So this is like, the Flyers, the Rangers, everybody else. 1975/76, we saw the first Summit Series. December 28th of 1975, Red Army, the only team that comes over that year, and eventually the Soviets sent over other teams, but Red Army beat the Rangers 7-3. On New Year's Eve, 1975, they tie the Montreal Canadiens at 3, which is something because the Montreal Canadiens, bit of a wagon at that point in time in the National Hockey League, and the 70s were a very good time for Montreal. So for the Red Army team to tie them, said something there. January 8th of 1976, Red Army then goes into Boston and wins 5-2. The only loss they suffered in 1976 was on January 11th against Philadelphia, 4-1. Was this the game where basically Philadelphia, the Broad Street Bullies, bullied the team right off the ice? Yeah. The Soviets did not like the way that the Flyers played hockey, which meant they were the same as every other NHL team at that point. Not big fans of the whole bullies thing that the Flyers had going on, but the Flyers got the only win in that series. Then in 1978, Spartak Moscow comes over. They went 3-2 against NHL competition. The Soviet Wings come over in 1979. They went 2-1-1 against NHL competition. 1980, they send 2 teams over. Dynamo Moscow comes over. They go 2-1-1, so 2 wins, a loss, and a tie. Red Army went 3-2 against the NHL in 1980. One thing that's interesting is the NHL didn't win any of these series between themselves and other teams. I think the unknown factor was part of it. We really didn't know who these players were. We didn't know what to expect. And it makes it hard to do any kind of pre-scouting or any kind of practice with your team. Plus, these games went on during the regular season. So Just imagine that, let's say the Capitals are playing at home on Saturday. They got a road game on Sunday, and then on Wednesday they're at home against a team from the KHL, and then on Friday they're back on the road. It's just you're putting that right in the middle of the schedule. Then in 1980, oh, I already did that part. 1983, Team USSR comes over, and they went 4-2 against the NHL. So the Soviet Union team comes over, and they were 4-2 in 6 games against NHL competition. Moscow Central Red Army went 5-1 against the NHL in 1986. They were good. They were really good. In fact, Red Army games, I enjoyed watching them because the passing, just the elite passing with those players. Then you get Dynamo Moscow. They went 2-1 against the NHL in 1986. Same year as Moscow Central Red Army came over. And then 1989, we saw another Super Series. Moscow Central Red Army went 4-2-1 against the NHL in 89. And Dynamo Riga went 5-2-1 against the NHL. So that's a combined record of 9-4-2 between those two Soviet-era teams. And the NHL kind of got beat up. Then in 1990, things changed a little bit in that Kimmich came over. And Kimmich didn't have quite that intimidation factor. 2 reasons. They weren't as good as the other teams, and B, those jerseys were so bright. They were unique jerseys. It's one of those ones that I know I have all these back here, and I have all these international jerseys too. Kimmich was one that I remember as a teenager looking at going, man, that's so ugly. I want that. 3-3. Kimmich went against the NHL in 1990. The Soviet Wings went 3-1 against the NHL. Moscow Central Red Army went 4-1. And Dynamo Moscow went 3-2 against the NHL in 1990. 1991, which would be the final year that we would see teams from Russia come over and play against NHL club teams. Kimmich went 3-1 against the NHL in 1991. Moscow Central Red Army went 6-1 against the NHL in 1991. Central Red Army was kind of a stacked team, so keep that in mind. Dynamo Moscow also went 3-2 against the NHL. So Kimmich tied against the NHL. Outside of that, is just the Soviet teams were just better. Or the NHL didn't have that preparation for the Soviet teams, and the Soviet teams had that preparation for the NHL. I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised to find out that the Soviets had scouts at all these, knew exactly what they were going up against, and NHL teams were kind of in the dark. That was just kind of the world we lived in at that time. Now, other international tournaments, the Canada Cup, the famous one. I missed the Canada Cup. And I know that it may, well, of course, he's Canadian. Why wouldn't he miss the Canada Cup? It just felt different. It hit different. When it went to the World Cup of Hockey, it just felt far more corporate. The Canada Cup still kind of had this small town kind of feel to it, for lack of a better way of putting it. 1976, in the final, Canada beats Czechoslovakia. That is, of course, what is currently Czechia and Slovakia. Czechoslovakia. Those countries split up, I want to say early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And has that affected them on the world stage? A little bit. More with the Slovaks, I think, than with the Czechs. The Czechs have still managed to get themselves medals here and there at the Worlds and whatnot. Slovakia, a bit more of a struggle, which is just kind of how demographics work and all that. Anyways, 1981, the USSR/Soviet Union beats Canada in the final. We don't talk about that one very much. It is interesting that the tournaments where Canada doesn't win don't get talked about as much in this country. Anyways, 1984, all is well. Canada beats Sweden in the final. 1987, Canada, famously. 87, to me, is still the best tournament of hockey I've ever watched. They beat the Soviets in the final. That final game was absolutely ridiculous. 1991, Canada beats the Americans in the final. The USA emerged in the early 90s. You had Brian Leetch, you had Mike Richter and others, Pat LaFontaine, and all of a sudden, while the Americans had always had players in the NHL the whole time I'd watched, we were starting to see more superstar players. We were starting to see that with NHL expansion, with the NHL being in other locations, more kids were picking up hockey sticks and skates. And honestly, yeah, eventually, because you have 10 times the population in the US that you have in Canada, odds are we're going to see the Americans end up with more really, really good superstar players than Canada. And as a National Hockey League fan, and as a Canuck fan, there's been a lot of American players playing for the Canucks, and Swedes playing for the Canucks, and Finns. If you're going to win, I'm not necessarily concerned with where somebody was born in the NHL, but yeah, international tournaments, it can hit a little bit different. So the Canada Cup ends in 91, and the Americans are emerging as a power. In 96, we get the World Cup of Hockey, and the Americans really put their statement on things by beating Canada in the final. And this was talked about a lot at the time. And it was one of the many times where the question gets asked, is Canada in decline? I've lost track of how many times I have read that Canadian hockey internationally is declining. Oh, things are bad. And I'm seeing all this, well, if Canada doesn't win this final of Four Nations, I guess they're done as a world power. Yeah, that's one game's going to tell us all that. Anyways, it's weird. It's bizarre to me that one game people can be like, well, that's it. Either you're the power or you're not. Just enjoy the game. So 2004, all was well again. Canada restores its place in the world by beating Finland in the final at the World Cup. Then we don't get another World Cup until 2016, where Canada beat Team Europe in the final. The Team Europe, Team North America thing didn't hit very well. Putting all the young guys on Team North America, fans didn't like it. I don't know how much the players liked it either, to be honest. And it just felt really, I don't know. It just didn't hit well, and so we didn't see another best on best tournament. Now, of course, part of it too is you get these lockouts in between, and you get these arguments with owners. Owners don't want to be paying a guy $14 million to play for Buffalo and then get injured wearing his country's jersey in a game that they're not being paid for because it's not part of their NHL contract. And I understand it from the owner's perspective, potentially from general managers' perspectives. I also understand players wanting to wear their country's logo. And this is a big part of the reason why the NHL is allowing for teams to go, or for players to go back to the Olympics. Is I think they want to have that piece when it comes to the labor piece side of things, and they want to make sure that the players are happy, so that the owners might get some of what they want here. Now, the Olympics, the NHL decides that they're going to start sending pros to the Olympics in 1998. And depending on who you ask, either the Olympics is better off as an amateurs-only tournament or amateurs-only setup, or the Olympics are just better for having the pros. I always actually appreciated the amateur side of it. I appreciated when guys from the Spengler Cup team would end up going over to play at the Olympics. I always appreciated the effort, even though Canada didn't necessarily do all that well, because all the best Canadians were playing in the National Hockey League. So 1998, we remember. If you're Canadian, you remember, right? So the Czech Republic wins gold that year because Dominik Hasek's fantastic. Russia was the silver medalist, and Finland won bronze. Canada flamed out, and there were questions about how the team was put together, who was taking shots in the shootout, who made what decisions about who was on what line. It was a great time, and we're going to see it again on Friday. I don't think it's going to matter who wins. I think we're going to see the second guessing no matter who wins of the team that loses. 2002, Canada, they win the Olympic gold. USA silver, Russia bronze. I always felt like both Canada and USA played better when the tournament was on North American soil, which is one thing to consider with the fact that the next two Olympics are in Europe. So maybe that affects things. We'll see, but it has affected things in the past. So 2006, Canada's in decline again. Sweden wins gold, and as a Canuck fan, I was actually pretty happy for some of the Swedish players that won gold there. Finland wins silver, and the Czech Republic wins bronze. Never take Finland lightly, ever. Just don't. Finland can win. Finland's a country that has 5 million people, and they stand up to countries of 400 million, 500. It doesn't matter. When it comes to hockey, Finland's dedicated. 2010, Canada wins gold. It's in Vancouver, and it felt like that was a big part of the factor, big factor in it. The USA wins silver, and Finland wins bronze. So really, really good showing for Canada there. And then in 2014, the final Olympics that Canada went to with NHL players, Canada wins gold there, Sweden wins bronze, and Finland, or silver for Sweden, bronze for Finland. So don't be too surprised if Sweden and Finland end up being really, really tough next year at the Olympics, because they won't be restricted to just taking players from the National Hockey League. And it always surprises people when they take players from like the SHL or Liga, but these are players they're familiar with. They believe they can play. They can wear the international, wear their national jersey in an international tournament, and very often those players end up playing really well. Plus, for players who are not National Hockey League players, having a good showing at the Olympics can get you a National Hockey League contract. I want to say Milan Hajduk had a really good tournament that I felt like helped get him into a National Hockey League contract in an NHL jersey. I felt like that was part of what propelled Hajduk into stardom in the National Hockey League. So the next Olympics is, as I said, in Italy next year. Then France hosts in 2030, so big tournaments there. And then the World Cup returns in 2028. So what we have right now with Four Nations is fun, but it's a one and done for this, and then we go back to the World Cup of hockey. The NHL's not working with the IIHF on it, so maybe it's just going to be NHL players, but they're going to look to add more countries than what we have in this tournament and make it feel more like it's a full-on best-on-best from, around the globe kind of thing. And I'm looking forward to that. So I felt like it was a good day to make this video, and that we're one day before the final tomorrow night. And, why not look all the way back at history? Because my memory goes back as far as, I want to say, like 86, when Central Red Army and Dynamo Moscow came over. And I had to watch those games. Because I was like, I don't, and just learning all these names and seeing all these players and being like, what moves are these? Because they played a completely different style of hockey, which we don't see now. Because Europeans have come over and played in North America for as long as they have, and they've had the influence on the game they've had, what we have now is really a hybrid of the North American style that we've always had and the European style as well, which always seemed to lend itself more to skill, the passing game, and really kind of that chess match where you're looking for that perfect shot. One thing that was notable with the Soviets/Russians when they would come over was not a lot of shots, but really accurate when they took their shots. They didn't take that shot until they were sure it was going to be a goal, which was weird because NHL teams would just slap shot, take a whole bunch of shots and they'll start going in. It was very different, and it had a dramatic effect on the league immediately. And who knows, maybe some of these tournaments can still have an effect on the NHL game as we see it. There's always the ebbs and flows in scoring. We shall see. It does make for an interesting picture, though. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. It's greatly appreciated. I will talk to you again soon.